All right, in this lecture, we're going to address another ethical theory, that is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism stands really in significant contrast with Immanuel Kant's ethics. We looked at Immanuel Kant's ethics in the last video lecture. Kant was concerned with duty. His theory, if you will remember, was also called a non-consequentialist theory. By the term non-consequentialist, we're emphasizing the fact that Mr. Kant was not concerned with consequences, thus the phrase non-consequentialism. He was not concerned with the consequences of our moral decisions. He was not concerned with the results or the outcome of our moral decisions. He was only concerned with doing one's duty. I may be at the risk of oversimplification, but I like to say that Mr. Kant was emphasizing the importance of one honoring their duty to a moral code. And that moral code can take a variety of forms. Mr. Kant's moral code came to be known as the categorical imperative, and we talked about the significance of that term, categorical imperative, which was that it is a universal command, and the principle of universality, and that stands in distinction to utilitarianism, which we're looking at today. Utilitarianism is a very popular theory today, especially in the political context, because it really is conducive to application in the policy area of governing and of legislation and of program administration and those kinds of things. So utilitarianism is very present on a macro scale in our culture and in the policy political decisions that are made by our representatives and governmental leaders and agency leaders. So with that having that in mind, we're going to turn now to the topic of utilitarianism, and I'm going to pull up the slide that deals with utilitarianism. And all right. So utilitarianism, there is the term, utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? We're going to look at the theory of utilitarianism, which in its most basic definitional term refers to doing in moral decision making. Utilitarianism advances that we take that moral action which will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of individuals. Now, that's really, in my opinion, kind of an oversimplification of utilitarianism, and yet it's a good summarization of the theory. It advances, once again, that we make moral decisions that will produce the greatest good or the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. There are two individuals that we're going to look at who were significant proponents of the theory of utilitarianism. One of those individuals was a man by the name of Jeremy Bentham, and the other of those individuals was John Stuart Mill. And so it's important that you understand, for our purposes in this lecture, the meaning of utilitarianism and what utilitarianism actually looks like. And then Bentham's understanding of utilitarianism, and then John Stuart Mill's understanding of utilitarianism, his approach to utilitarianism. And then finally, it's important that you understand the distinction between those two and their approaches to utilitarianism. So those are especially general themes that you should take away from this lecture. So utilitarianism, like Immanuel Kant and Kantian ethics, is concerned with making ethical judgments. Let's talk a little bit about ethical judgments. On the slide in front of you, the statement says ethical philosophy differs from the sciences because it is normative or prescriptive rather than descriptive. The sciences biology, chemistry, physics do not necessarily or predominantly try to give normative guidelines or prescriptive guidelines so much as they attempt to describe what actually is or describe what actually occurs under certain circumstances. Ethics is different from the sciences in that ethics does have a component of description that is known as descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics describes the way things are, uh, describes the way individuals are behaving, or the way individuals are acting, uh, the way individuals are making moral decisions. That's descriptive ethics. It's simply describing. But ethics also comes in two other forms: normative or prescriptive. Those really are two ways to refer to the same quality of ethics. Normative or prescriptive ethics do not talk about the way things are or the way that people are making moral decisions, but rather normative or prescriptive ethics talks about the way that people should make moral decisions. So the difference is descriptive ethics describe the way things are. Um, Prescriptive or normative ethics describe the way things should be. So those terms, are and should be, really vividly portray the distinction between descriptive and normative or prescriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics would say something to the effect of people are let's just take an individual. He is making moral decisions based upon his past upbringing. That's descriptive ethics. It's simply describing what he is doing. Normative ethics or prescriptive ethics will say he should be making moral decisions based upon his religious faith. Uh, so the operative word there in that context is should be. So descriptive ethics simply describes. Prescriptive or normative ethics prescribe or say how someone should or ought to make moral decisions. We're telling them how to act. So those different categories are important. Next, in other words, ethics tells us how we ought to act. I should say prescriptive or normative ethics tells us how we ought to act or what we should do, while the sciences are more likely to observe how things are in nature and society. So, but also there is a form, and I say this again, of descriptive ethics. We simply describe the way people are behaving. Um, there's in ethical thought, there is descriptive ethics, and then there is normative ethics and prescriptive ethics. And normative and prescriptive ethics are essentially two sides of the same coin, which address shouldness or oughtness, how people should behave or how people ought to behave. With regard to making ethical judgments, I want us to look at very quickly some areas of emphasis in making moral judgments. So when we're making moral judgments, or we're assessing moral dilemmas and how we should respond, we can assess those judgments and make those judgments on the basis of purpose or motive. And Mr. Kant got at that when he talked about in our last lecture, we should be occupied with or possessed by a goodwill, a goodwill to do the right thing, a desire, a deep-seated heart's desire to do the right thing. So we can evaluate a person's moral actions by their motive. We can evaluate a person's making moral judgments by an act or a rule or a maxim. And that would be something to the effect of Mr. Kant, once again, the categorical imperative: act in such a way that you would will that everyone act in that same way in the same moral situation. That is a rule or a maxim by which Kant says moral behavior should be governed. Then we can also assess moral behavior based on results or consequences. And that's where utilitarianism, which we're addressing today, falls. Utilitarianism is consequentialist. It's outcome concerned. It's results concerned. It looks at the moral decision that we make, and then it assesses the outcome of that moral decision. If the outcome of that moral decision is good, then it was a good moral decision. If the outcome of that moral decision was bad, then it was a bad moral decision. So the decision is not inherently right or wrong in and of itself, but it is right or wrong, moral, immoral, ethical, unethical, on the basis of the outcomes, consequences, or the results which are produced by the moral decision. And I illustrated that in our last lecture by talking about speeding down the highway going 75. And then we began to think, well, if I get a ticket, then I'll have to take that out of my paycheck, and I will not have as much money to spend on other things that I might want. That's a consequence of getting a ticket. Another consequence might be that my insurance rates go up. Another consequence might be that my insurance is canceled. Another consequence might be that my wife becomes angry at me. Those kinds of things. That's consequentialist ethics, determining what one should do based upon an examination or a consideration or an anticipation of the consequences of one's moral act. So let's talk specifically now about making ethical judgments in utilitarianism, bearing what we just said in mind. Utilitarianism says that the result or the consequence of an act is the real measure of whether it is good or bad. Utilitarianism really is kind of an assessment approach to ethical decision making. Utilitarianism says you make the moral decision, and then you look at the outcome of the moral decision or the result of the moral decision. If it's to continue speeding or not to continue speeding. If the results are good, then it was a good moral decision. If the results were bad, it was a bad moral decision. In other words, it's important that you understand that in utilitarianism, the decision in and of itself is not right, nor is it wrong, but rather the nature, the moral nature of the decision is determined on the basis of the outcome or the results or the consequences which are produced by the outcome. So if you were to see a question on an exam, for example, in the future, regarding utilitarianism's view of a moral decision, the moral decision is not innately right or wrong, but it is right or wrong on the basis purely of the consequences that it produces. Another thing that we can say regarding utilitarianism is that this theory emphasizes ends over means. It emphasizes ends over means. That's a concise way of saying utilitarianism is concerned with the end result. Utilitarianism is concerned with the end result. Utilitarianism is concerned with the outcome of our moral decisions. It's not concerned with the means, the moral decision itself, so much as it is concerned with the outcome. If the outcome is good, it was a good moral decision. If the outcome is bad, it was a bad moral decision. So it requires some degree of assessment when the results come in or the consequences come about. Next, theories such as utilitarianism that emphasize results. These theories are called teleological or consequentialist ethics. Teleological. Mr. Kant's theory was deontological. Deontological, but they emphasize duty. But utilitarianism is not deontological for the purposes of an exam question. Utilitarianism is teleological. That means that it's concerned with the outcome, the results. Utilitarianism is also known as consequentialism. Why? Because it is concerned with consequences. So don't make these concepts more difficult than they really are. They really can be very self-explanatory if you just think them through. Teleological, telescope, looking at a planet away, that's looking at something in the future. That's the way I think of it. teleological telescope, it's concerned with outcome or something that's in the future. Deontological is concerned with duty, duty to a moral code. So those things having been said, here is the first advocate of utilitarianism that we're going to look at. This is Mr. Jeremy Bentham. If you'll look at the slide in front of you, he is encased in a stall of a sort. I think it's at the University of London. He taught, I think it was at the University of London, and he was greatly revered. He made a tremendous impact in social policy. He made a tremendous impact in the on the prison system with regard to his theory. He emphasized the rehabilitation of prisoners rather than the punishment of prisoners. He was greatly revered. He was a brilliant individual, they say. He went to Oxford, I believe. I think he went to Oxford when he was age 13 or 14, and then he graduated from Oxford at age 17 or 18. So he was a very brilliant individual. I believe that was Mr. Bentham. But here, after he died, the school so revered him, they essentially had his body taxidermied and placed him in a stall, in a little encasement there in one of the rotundas of the school in which he taught. And so that's Mr. Bentham's actual body in the case, enshrined in the case. And people entering into the school would pass by this case of Mr. Bentham, who was so revered in the school. That's just how revered he was. So an interesting thing that happened, if you'll look closely at this photo, look at his head underneath his hat. That is not actually his real head. His real head, if you'll look down toward the bottom of the slide, is between his feet. And that's because after the passing of years, something happened. His head fell off. And so they left his original head, which had been embalmed or taxidermied or whatever. They arranged it there on the floor beneath his feet, and had another head molded in his likeness. So kind of a morbid scenario there, but nonetheless, it does tell us how revered Mr. Bentham was in the school as a utilitarian. He was a brilliant mind. Another little story about this is Mr. Bentham had always wanted to come to New York City and to America, but he never made the trip. He was never able to make the trip. And so just last year, I believe it was, his head was on display, just his head was on display in one of the museums in New York City. And they did that in order to be able to say that they had assured that Mr. Bentham would make it to New York City. Well, I'm not sure he was aware of that. I'm not sure he was aware of that, but anyhow, that's over with. You can't go to New York City and see his head now. But nonetheless, that's interesting. That's Mr. Bentham, a major proponent and advocate, really, I think, the originator of utilitarianism, and very renowned figure in England. So let's talk about Mr. Bentham's formulation of utilitarianism. First of all, Mr. Bentham says that humanity, or man, in his words, in his day, we would say humanity today, is under two great masters. We are governed, we are dominated, we are dictated by two great masters. One of those masters is pain. We avoid pain. And secondly, the other master is pleasure. We pursue pleasure. So we eschew pain, we avoid pain, we try to stay away from that which is uncomfortable, and then we pursue, we desire pleasure. Now, when he speaks of pleasure, he's not just speaking of physical pleasure, he's speaking also of intellectual pleasure, social pleasure, cultural pleasure, etc. So not just physical pleasure. In our day and time, when we think of pleasure, we think of maybe physical pleasure in the sense of sexuality and those kinds of things. But bear in mind that Mr. Bentham, when he talks about pleasure, is talking about much, much more than just physical pleasure. He's talking about the pleasure that comes with physicality, but also the pleasure that comes with the enjoyment of good friends, the enjoyment of great literature, the enjoyment of great art, the enjoyment of great stage plays, the enjoyment of good things in life across the board, the enjoyment of comfort, the enjoyment of status, those kinds of things. The enjoyment of service, the enjoyment of work, the enjoyment of education, etc. So he says we are dominated by those two masters, pain and pleasure. That would be a really good exam question. The great good that we seek is happiness, he says. Now, let me talk about happiness in Mr. Bentham's definition of happiness. He's not talking about emotional happiness like we would. When we say the word happiness, we're thinking about giddiness or chuckling or an emotion. But Mr. Bentham is not talking about happiness in that sense. He's talking about happiness in the sense of pleasurable things, contentment, and those kinds of things that might be physical pleasure, like I said, or artistic pleasure, or intellectual pleasure, or social pleasure. So when you read the word happiness as relates to utilitarianism, always think of the word pleasure, enjoyment, all right, not just physical pleasure. Now, it says this is a hedonistic perspective. Hedonism is the simply means refers to the desire for pleasure. If we are hedonistic, we are pleasure oriented. Now, once again, not just physical pleasure, but pleasure in the sense of enjoying life in its totality, physical, social, cultural, intellectual, etc. Next, those actions whose results increase happiness or diminish pain are good. In other words, they have utility. Utility basically means they serve a purpose, they have a function, they have an impact, they have a practical benefit. That's the way I would think of it in the terms of a practical benefit. Those actions whose results increase or diminish pain are good. So, if we go to a stage play and we enjoy the arts or the theater, or if we go to a musical concert and we enjoy that, then that's good. It has a practical benefit. It makes us feel good. We enjoy that moment in our lives and we pursue those kinds of things. We long for those kinds of things. That's why we long for the weekend, because we want to engage in those activities that maybe get us away from the drudgery of work or the drudgery of school and the inconvenience of it all, and go do things that make us feel good about ourselves and lead to enjoyment in life. All right. So they have utility, thus the word utilitarianism. Now, Mr. Bentham, as a result of that, came up with what some term a hedonistic calculus. That's a fancy way of saying a way to calculate the amount of good that is produced, or the amount of enjoyment that is produced by a certain activity. He says that in determining the quantity of happiness that might be produced by an action, we evaluate the possible consequences by applying several values. Now, I want you to notice in that statement the word quantity of happiness. Mr. Bentham was concerned with the quantity of happiness, the amount of happiness in our lives, or the amount of enjoyment, or the amount of pleasure. So as a result, this is a quantitative theory that he is advocating. Now, that's important for this reason. It's going to stand in distinction to John Stuart Mill, who became concerned not with the quantity of happiness produced by our moral decisions, but rather he became concerned with the quality of the happiness produced by our decisions. So back to Mr. Bentham. Mr. Bentham says we should determine the quantity of happiness, the amount of happiness that is produced by a certain activity. And he came up with certain activities, and he came up with consideration of factors that we should look at. He says we should look at the intensity of the pleasure or the contentment, the duration, how long it lasts, the certainty or the uncertainty, the propinquity, that's a word that we never use, or the remoteness, how far away is it, how immediate is it, the fecundity, the purity, and the extent. So those are things, those are variables that he said we should take into consideration when we're thinking about the quantity of happiness. How long will it last? How intense will it be? How certain or uncertain is it? How remote? How far off in the future is it? Or is it immediate, etc.? So he was concerned with quantitative happiness. The amount of happiness, the amount of pleasure, the amount of enjoyment that is produced in life by certain activities. The four theses of utilitarianism for Mr. Bentham are as follows. First of all, consequentialism, the rightness of actions determined solely by their consequences. All right, so utilitarianism is consequentialist. Number two, utilitarianism is hedonistic. In the sense that it is concerned with the pleasure or enjoyment or contentment in life. Utilitarianism is maximalistic. It's concerned with maximalism. It wants to produce the greatest good consequences and the least bad consequences. And then universalism also characterizes utilitarianism. The consequences to be considered are those of everyone affected and everyone equally. So everyone is treated equally, and the consequences of everyone affected. So it's characterized by a kind of universalism. So those are four basic tenets or theses of utilitarianism thus far, as we have them under Mr. Bentham. Two formulations of utilitarian theory, the principle of utility, the best action. The principle of utility says that the best action is that which produces the greatest happiness and or reduces pain. That's one principle, the principle of utility. So you should be aware of the principle of utility. Utilitarianism says that the best action is that which produces the greatest pleasure and produces the least pain. So when you're making a moral decision, utilitarian advocates say that you make the moral decision that will produce the greatest pleasure, the greatest enjoyment of life, the greatest security in life, and will also result in the least inconvenience or the least pain in life. Because once again, Mr. Bentham was very concerned to say that we pursue pleasure and we avoid pain. And as such, utilitarianism centers around that notion. That's principle one. Principle two is concerned with the greatest happiness. We ought to do that which will produce the greatest happiness and the least pain for the greatest number of people. All right. So those are the two big formulations of utilitarianism. There are two types of utilitarianism. There's act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says that an action is right if and only if it produces the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for the greatest number. That's act utilitarianism, and that was advocated by Jeremy Bentham. An action is right if and only if it produces the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for the greatest number of people. Rule utilitarianism says an action is right if and only if it conforms to a set of rules, which in general would produce the greatest pleasure over pain for the greatest number of people. That's Mr. Mill. Now, once again, notice Mr. Bentham is concerned with act utilitarianism. He's concerned with the action. Mr. Mill is concerned with the rule, a set of rules, a set of maxims that guide our moral behavior. So Mr. Bentham is concerned only with the act. Mr. Mill is concerned with the actual rule that governs the act. The application of utilitarian theory. Let's look at this. A, you attempt to help an elderly man across the street, and he gets across the street safely. Well, that was a good act. Why was it a good act? It was a good act because the outcome was good. All right. It was a good act because the outcome was good. You were helping him across the street. Was that the right thing to do? Well, you wait and see if he got across the street safely. Yes. If he got across the street safely, then it was a good act. You attempt to help an elderly man across the street. You stumble as you go. He is knocked into the path of a car and is hurt. Is that a good act? No, that's not a good act. The act was bad. Why? Because the outcome was bad. That's just the most simplistic, basic application of the theory of utilitarianism. Your takeaway there should be this: that the outcome determined whether the act was good. The act was not good in and of itself, but it was good only on the basis of the consequences or result of the act. Under the first scenario, the consequence was good. He made it across the street safely. Therefore, you did a good deed. Under the second scenario, the outcome was bad. You tripped, he fell, he got hit by a car. The outcome was bad. You did a bad deed. So the outcome determines the nature of the deed. Another application of utilitarian theory: if you can use 80 soldiers as a decoy in war and thereby attack an enemy force and kill several hundred enemy soldiers, that is a morally good choice, even though the 80 might be lost. All right. So that's demonstrative of the fact that utilitarianism is concerned with producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. How many people were benefited? 100. How many people, or several hundred, were killed? I should say several hundred soldiers were killed. But in the process of killing several hundred enemy soldiers, how many were lost? 80. So 100 enemy soldiers killed through the sacrifice of 80. That means that was a good act. That was a good deed. So it's aimed at producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The greater good there was that more enemy soldiers were killed than your own soldiers were lost. So you're kind of getting a hint now of some of the challenges of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is willing to sacrifice the few for the many. Utilitarianism is willing to sacrifice the few in the interest of the many. All right. Utilitarianism just acknowledges that the perfect situation does not exist where we can lose none. But if we have to sacrifice 10 in order to save 100, then that's all right. So be it. We lose the 10. So the individual becomes less and less important in utilitarianism. And what's concerned is what utilitarianism is concerned with is the greatest number of people. All right. If lying or stealing will actually bring about more happiness and reduce pain, act utilitarianism says we should lie and we should steal in those cases. So if lying or stealing actually brings about more happiness or reduces pain, then utilitarianism says there's nothing at all wrong with lying or stealing. So, back to that situation with regard to Anne Frank that we talked about earlier in one of our previous lectures. If lying and saying that Anne Frank is not in your house, lying to the Nazi soldier who comes by to arrest her, if lying and to the Nazi soldier and saying she's not hiding in your house, if that saves her life, then lying is permissible there. So once again, the act in and of itself is not right or wrong. It's the consequence of the act. Lying saves her life, therefore it was a good thing to lie. So under certain circumstances, lying is permissible. And our stealing would be permissible. So you're getting a sense now of some of the challenges of utilitarianism. It challenges what we might regard as some of the traditional notions of morality, some of the traditional notions of right and wrong. All right, actual cases The decision at Coventry during World War II, the decision was made not to inform the town that they would be bombed. So this is an actual historical event. The decision was made not to inform the town of Coventry in England during World War II that they would be bombed. The Nazi soldiers were on the way, the Nazi airplanes were on the way to bomb the town of Coventry, but the government made the decision not to notify Coventry because they were wanting to entrap the Nazi airplanes and the Nazi army, the Nazi Air Force, I guess, and entrap them and then take them out. So they sacrificed the town of Coventry in the interest of trying to win the war. So that's an example of utilitarianism's concern with the many over the few. Another example, the Ford Pinto case. A defective vehicle would sometimes explode when it was hit. In law school, we read these cases. There was a design defect in the Ford Pinto of many decades ago. And the design defect resulted in the fact that whenever they were hit by another automobile in an accident, the Pinto would explode. And typically in those situations, the manufacturer is forced to address whether or not it's going to recall the vehicle because of the risk to the public. But here, the model was not recalled and repaired by Ford because they felt like it was cheaper to pay liability suits than to recall and repair all of the defective cars. Isn't that interesting? So that was kind of an economic decision. That was an economic decision that the company made, the Ford company made. They said that's an example of a utilitarian principle. They were willing to spend money for suits because in order to make the repairs, they were going to have to spend more money. They didn't take into consideration the lives that were affected. They were only concerned with what would benefit them and the greatest amount of money that they would save. So those are really specific examples of how utilitarianism kind of plays itself out in real life. So next, let's look at criticisms of Mr. Bentham's theory. Mr. Bentham's theory could mean that if 10 people would be happy watching a man be eaten by wild dogs, it would be a morally good thing for the 10 men to kidnap someone and throw the man into a cage of wild, hungry dogs. So, I mean, it's a slippery slope argument, but nonetheless, utilitarianism does seem to open the door to that kind of thinking. Is utilitarianism a good theory? Yes, it's a good theory. Does it have its weaknesses? Yes, it has its weaknesses. Just like any other theory, it can be abused, it can be misinterpreted, it can be misapplied. Now then, that's Mr. Bentham in utilitarianism. Let's turn to the second advocate, Mr. Mill in utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, his adjustments, his adaptations of utilitarianism. Mill argues that we must consider the quality of the happiness and not merely the quantity of the happiness. So with regard to that, notice that Mr. Bentham was concerned with the quantity or the amount of happiness that is produced by a moral decision. Mr. Mill says that's inadequate. We can't just take into consideration the quantity of the happiness, but we have to take into consideration the quality of the happiness that is produced by our moral decisions. For example, some might find happiness with a pitcher of beer and a pizza. Others may find happiness watching a fine Shakespearean play. The quality of happiness is greater with the Shakespearean play than with the latter. So if we compare the quality of the happiness that is produced by the Shakespearean play and the quality of happiness produced by the pitcher of beer and pizza, Mr. Mill would say that the quality of the happiness is better with the Shakespearean play than it is with the beer and pizza. Now, I know there's some of you out there listening to this who probably would disagree with that. You would think that you would argue that the beer and pizza is a much better quality of enjoyment than listening to boring, drudgery-like Shakespearean play, that would be hell for you. But at least you get the point here. He's concerned with the quality of the happiness that is produced, all right? So Mr. Mill's quality arguments, all right? He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, all right? So he's comparing the quality of satisfaction between being a human being and a pig. It's better to be a human being satisfied than a pig dissatisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So he's concerned with the quality. He says, you look at our statuses in life. It's better to be a human being who is dissatisfied than to be a pig who is satisfied. So he's concerned with the quality. The quality of dissatisfaction in a human being is superior to the quality of satisfaction in an unthinking pig. Although pigs, they say, are pretty smart. I grew up on a farm, and we had like 300 hogs that I had to feed, and et cetera, et cetera. So pigs can be, oddly enough, very, very, very smart. They're really smarter than cattle. In a lot of ways. But anyhow, you don't give a flip about that. Mr. Mill's quality arguments further. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. In the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility: to do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. So Mr. Mill even found in the teachings of Jesus a basis for his qualitative argument regarding utilitarianism. Now then, let's talk about some criticisms of utilitarianism. If I am to bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number and not put my own happiness above others, that may lead to a dilemma. All right. If I am to bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people and not put my happiness above your happiness, that may lead to a dilemma. I live in a neighborhood where 83% of my neighbors use drugs. I can make them most happy by helping supply them with cheap drugs. Really, now think about this. This is a practical outcome. It may be an argument ad absurdum, but nonetheless still a possible practical implication of utilitarianism. If 83% of my neighbors use drugs, then I can make them happiest with cheap drugs. But I feel uncomfortable in doing that. What should a utilitarian do? Well, a pure utilitarian might say, well, your feelings don't matter whether you're uncomfortable with it or not. That's beside the point. If it's going to make the majority of your neighbors, 83% of them, happy, then therefore you supply them with cheap drugs. So utilitarianism, like Kant's theory of ethics, can lead to some absurd actions and some absurd decisions. Another criticism: Bernard Williams criticizes what is called the doctrine of negative responsibility. You won't need to know that name for the purposes of the exam. For example, he says, a thug breaks into my home and holds 6 people hostage, telling us that he will kill all of us. However, the thug says, if you will kill 2 of your family, I will let you and the other 3 live. Well, who's going to do that? Utilitarianism might allow for that possibility. Why? Because it would save more people than it would sacrifice. So utilitarianism in its purest form might allow for that. So utilitarianism can be problematic. It can, and none of these theories is without flaw and without problem. With utilitarianism, the good thing to do is to kill 2 members of my family. But who's going to do that? You know, unless it's 2 members of your family that you don't like. You know, I don't. But hopefully your dislike of them doesn't exceed. It doesn't move to that extreme, but just stay away from them. So anyhow, that's that. But the illustration is well made. The point is well made that utilitarianism can really lead to some absurd actions and some absurd outcomes. Another criticism, utilitarianism plays fast and loose with religious commandments. If lying and stealing or killing could lead to an increase of happiness for the greatest number, then utilitarianism says it's okay to lie, steal, cheat, kill, etc. So that can be problematic if you are a religious person. uh, Mill's answer to the godless theory of criticism, Mill's response to the last, what is the nature of God? Does God make arbitrary rules just to see if we will obey? Does God make rules that he knows will lead to our happiness? You don't need to know that for the exam. I just threw that in there because I was thinking about it at the time. Let me see, what else? Uh, a second criticism of utilitarianism is if one must decide the probable outcome of an act before knowing whether the act is good or bad, how can children learn to evaluate acts since they know so little of what the consequences might arise from their actions? Well, that critique is a weak critique, I think. I think children can learn that. The utilitarian would say children can learn that from suffering the consequences, the pain and the pleasure. If they suffer bad consequences, they will avoid that action in the future. If they enjoy the benefits of that decision, then they will follow through and repeat that same action in the future. So that is very easily addressed. Now let's talk briefly about Mr. Mill's rule utilitarianism, which stands in distinction to Mr. Bentham's act utilitarianism. Mr. Mill says mankind must by this time have acquitted positive beliefs as to the effects of some actions on their happiness, and the beliefs which have thus come down are the rules of morality for the multitude and for the philosopher until he has succeeded in finding. What he's saying in that slide is essentially this, that based on the history of humankind and the consequences we have suffered, we have developed some rules that have emerged from those scenarios of the past that are to guide our behavior and guide our conduct. So he says we know from our actions and from having experienced the consequences of our actions that there are certain rules that should be obeyed because they produce good consequences, and there are certain rules that should be avoided. Are certain rules that should be certain things that should be disobeyed, I should say, because they have adverse consequences or negative consequences. That's essentially what Mr. Mill is getting at with regard to his his rule utilitarianism. Let me see. I'm not going to address that material there. This here, we're not going to worry about that. You can look at that on your own. There won't be anything on the exam from these slides. But that's really all I want to say with regard to utilitarianism. Now, let me kind of wrap up utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an interesting theory. It really plays itself out in government and in policy, governmental policy, legislative policy. When the governmental entities are making decisions, they have to take into consideration the totality of the national population or the totality of the people that will be affected by the decision. And then they know that everyone cannot be benefited. So they have to make a decision which will benefit the most people and harm, cause pain, discomfort for the fewest people. And so we see utilitarianism really, if you ever run for a political office or a legislative office and you're involved in policy decisions, or if you're ever working for an agency and you're implementing policy decisions, you'll see utilitarianism working itself out. Utilitarianism simply acknowledges that 100% of the people cannot be benefited. We have to benefit as many people as we possibly can and hurt as few people as we possibly can. So utilitarianism is a very significant policy mechanism and policy theory. So that's utilitarianism. Hope that you've benefited from this. And once again, understand the nature of utilitarianism, understand the definition of utilitarianism, understand Mr. Bentham and his understanding of utilitarianism, his theory, understand Mr. Mill and his theory of utilitarianism, and then finally understand the difference between the two, which one emphasizes quantitative utilitarianism and which one emphasizes qualitative utilitarianism. All right, have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.